Mysteries and puzzles are concepts that have intrigued the general population for generations. The concept of being presented with an unknown and poking at it until you uncover the solution is a very human experience. Despite this, mystery literature didn't begin to take hold in the cultural consciousness until around the early to mid 19th century. It was at that point when not only were literacy rates in Europe skyrocketing, but also we started to see the first detective positions be created in formal police forces in order to handle the influx of crimes that was occurring due to Europe rapidly urbanizing. These two events sparked the imagination and naturally caused the creation of early crime literature. While the first recorded mystery stories are credited to Edgar Allan Poe, it's not until Arthur Conan Doyle came along with the invention of his famous character Sherlock Holmes that mysteries became a mainstay of the pop cultural zeitgeist. So, with all of this in mind, there's just one mystery left to be solved. Why the hell don't we talk about Professor Layton anymore? Hi, my name is Eric. Welcome to Backlog Gaming, the show where I take you guys through my own backlog or just give you games for your own backlog. And today we're going to be talking about Professor Layton and the Unwound Future. Professor Layton and the Unwound Future is the third game of the Professor Layton franchise and the conclusion to the original trilogy of Layton video games. Professor Layton is the flagship franchise of Level 5 Inc., a second-party developer that works very closely with Nintendo, whom nowadays might be more well-known for Yokai Watch. So, why am I only talking about the third game in the trilogy? I just really like this one. Unwound Future is a beautiful game that I would recommend to anyone, but even though I will keep story spoilers to a minimum, I would suggest you play the previous two games in the franchise first, Professor Layton and the Curious Village, and Professor Layton and the Diabolical Box, as this game does build off of their stories. But regardless, this video should be rather standalone. So, let's jump into it, shall we? Professor Layton is a series of puzzle-solving adventure games presented in a similar style to visual novels, with character dialogue being presented through a series of in-game portraits. The games were released exclusively through the Nintendo DS.
This is Nintendo DS.
And took advantage of the touchscreen functionality of the console to allow players to directly interact with the environments of the game. Traversal through the worlds of Layton is primarily done through a point-and-click system, and the physical buttons on the Nintendo DS are rarely used, if at all. This allowed the original trilogy of games to recently be re-released on mobile app stores over the last few years for cheaper than they were released on the consoles, and more expensive than most phone apps that you would even consider buying. But I promise, they're worth it. The quality of these games truly justifies their price. The Professor Layton franchise was created when game director Akihiro Hino was inspired by a series of puzzle books from his childhood called Atama no Taiso, or head games, to make a video game that primarily focused on a series of puzzles. Akihiro was able to hire the writer of these works, the late Akira Tago, who tragically passed in 2016, to design the puzzles for the first 6 mainline games in the franchise. The Professor Layton games did very well, grossing an estimated over 15.5 million sales across 7 games, and is one of the flagship franchises of the Nintendo DS family of systems, When designing a protagonist for his game, Akihiro took heavy inspiration from the protagonist of the very successful Capcom legal drama simulator Ace Attorney, Phoenix Wright. Uncoincidentally, Phoenix and Layton would eventually cross paths in an out-of-continuity crossover game simply titled Professor Layton vs. Phoenix Wright. What resulted was Herschel Layton, a very serious professor of archaeological studies, and to bring in a little bit more youthful energy and balance out the humor and tone of the games, the professor was accompanied by Luke Triton, a curious young boy with a witty attitude and a love for animals that would become the professor's apprentice. The first two games of the series had Luke and Layton solving mysteries for the people they came across while solving puzzles that would be thrown their way, an aspect of the games which is metatextually referred to as weird by Layton in the first game, and then retroactively just treated as normal by the time Diabolical Box is released. The mysteries in these games are honestly something that the game just kind of solves for the player, and the solutions to the mysteries were very convoluted.
That dog is enormous!
Wrong again, Luke.
What do you mean, Professor?
As I suspected, what appears to be a larger-than-average dog is actually a hologram projected from an orbital satellite.
Huh?
But it's the emphasis on the journey to get there and the strength of these characters that make the stories of these games compelling. And speaking of story, boy does Unwound Future have a great one. In addition to in-game dialogue, the story is told largely through in-game cutscenes. The cutscenes are traditionally animated and fit with the tone of the game very well. And while we're on the topic, the animation and art style of this game is beautiful. It takes a lot of inspiration from classic cartoons, but still feels very modern while having that retro edge. Without giving too much away, the basic premise of the story is that a series of 3 events happens within 1 week. A demonstration of a time machine goes wrong, leading to the Mayor of London going missing, Layton and Luke finding a letter from what appears to be a version of Luke from the future, and finally, Luke and Layton enter a clock shop in London, and when they exit, they find a completely different London from when they enter. Again, I don't want to spoil too much, but what results is a truly emotional story of loss and grief that delves into the backstory of Herschel Layton and is honestly probably the first game that truly made me cry. It's a very character-driven game and gives satisfying conclusions to character arcs that I didn't even realize had started in the first place. But, of course, we must talk about the main attraction of the Professor Layton franchise outside of its story, the puzzles. Each puzzle is assigned a number of picarats, a unit used by the game to convey puzzle difficulty and act as your score throughout the playthrough. The more times that you fail a puzzle and try again,
There we go. Frankly, I'm ashamed.
the lower your picarat score goes, and the less you're able to unlock once you've completed the story and ventured into the extras. If you're stuck on a puzzle, you can always find hint coins, a curious collectible that you can find throughout the backgrounds of the various locations Layton journeys to just by tapping on your screen. And some of these hint coins will be in rather
Look, Professor, I found a hit coin.
Luke, what the are you doing on the moon?
peculiar situations. In terms of the puzzles themselves, there's a good mix of logical, pattern solving, and maths puzzles. And sometimes you'll just be staring at a puzzle for a little while and then It hits you and you instantly have the right answer.
That should do it. Another puzzle solved.
It's always such a good feeling, but it does make you feel just a little stupid for not figuring it out sooner. Many puzzles aren't required for the main story of the game, but there will be occasional checkpoints throughout your adventure and story beats that will be locked behind you having completed a certain number of puzzles. Of course, if you truly want to challenge yourself, I would recommend trying to solve every single puzzle in the game to get that little golden Layton head stamp on your save file. Because after all, in the words of the good professor, a true gentleman leaves no puzzle unsolved. And finally, I would be remiss to talk about the Professor Layton games without talking about the music. The score for the Professor Layton franchise is composed by Tomohito Nishira. Throughout the original trilogy of Layton games, Nishira composed a very orchestral soundtrack full of strings and percussion that really gives an atmospheric touch to the franchise. And the music in Unwound Future is the most epic out of the entire original trilogy. And the entire franchise has a great soundtrack that I'd recommend listening to even if you don't get around to playing the games themselves. I've definitely listened to my fair share of these compilation videos on YouTube while working on this video. Just be careful about this video in particular, because nowadays the future of the Professor Layton franchise is largely up in the air. We haven't had a new game in 4 years, and the last game that did release kind of underperformed. Towards the end of the franchise's lifespan, Level 5 seemed to have really dumped their eggs in the Yokai Watch basket because they saw it as a potential challenger or killer for Pokemon, neither of which ended up being the case. Overall, this is a really great game. It has that really specific vibe where it's a cold, rainy day and you're sitting by the window with the fireplace blazing, you're swaddled in a blanket and just tapping away at the DS. Just pure childhood comfort that we rarely get in our adult lives. If you still have a DS and can track down a cheap copy, I would recommend that you do that, or just download the HD remake on your smartphone. It's a very faithful recreation of the original with a few minor tweaks here and there. So, regardless of how you play the game, I recommend you put this one on your backlog.